First, we had Liberation Day, when Trump announced sweeping across-the-board tariffs on damn near every country on the planet. Then, less than a week after Liberation Day, we had, I guess, what we can call Just Kidding Day, when Trump announced that he was suspending most of the big tariffs on most countries, but actually also simultaneously doing an even bigger tariff on China. And then he announced right after that, the gigantic tariff on China was actually going to come with carve-outs for so many of the most important electronic goods that we buy from China that it actually worked out to disincentivize domestic manufacturing of those things, if you look at the details, because any American manufacturer would have to pay crazy heavy tariffs on all the component parts, while the entirely Chinese manufactured versions would actually come in without the tariffs. But of course, what I'm describing is Trump's tariff policy as of a couple of days ago. And I didn't whip out my phone before starting this segment to check out how the policy might have changed. So whatever it is now, it's probably totally different than what I'm describing. And, wait another 72 hours after that, and it'll be different again, because none of this is going through Congress. It's all being done by presidential decree through this fake national emergency status that lets Trump change it every time he has a new whim, which happens a lot. It's a giant mess, and it's quite likely that this cascade of presidential whims is going to get us an awful lot of pain for ordinary working class consumers at the grocery store for a while at absolutely best, and a huge economic crisis at worst. And the way he's doing it pretty well guarantees that we're not even going to reshore any jobs in the process. So if the question on the table is what Trump is doing a good idea, I guess I would suggest that that's not a very interesting question. Just to be clear, the answer is no. Although in a minute, we'll play you a clip of somebody who disagrees, who has a different take on that. For the moment, though, I'll just note that, like in that Benny Johnson clip we were just watching, it's very, very funny in a very grim way that all these right-wing influencers who are normally all about capital T, capital E, the economy as the be-all and end-all of everything, and regularly cream their boxers thinking about the glories of the free market, have suddenly started to sound these themes about how, hey, why do you care about crass material possessions anyway? Don't you know desire is the root of suffering? But the reason I'm talking about tariffs right now is that I think there are questions we can ask here that are a hell of a lot more interesting than, is what Trump is doing good? Or do we all feel nice and liberated since Liberation Day? Because there's a broader set of questions here about how to respond and push back against the swirling chaos of the Trump 2.0 administration and put forward an alternative vision. And I want to take a long step back and think about that bigger question, then come back and bring it to the point I want to make about tariffs. I think I've been pretty clear on this show that I'm really not the kind of leftist who thinks that Democrats or Republicans are exactly the same, and it doesn't matter for the left or the workers' movement whether we're ruled by the comparatively moderate wing of capital or by the most militant and demented wing of capital. I've seen a lot of people in comments on these YouTube videos say I have TDS. If you're not hopelessly online, that stands for Trump derangement syndrome, because I think that Trumpism 2.0 is, in fact, disturbingly authoritarian and dangerous, and we are actually reaching the point where we need to be talking about defending liberal democracy as such. Those of us who want to replace liberal capitalist democracy with something better should be worried about the possibility that it's going to be replaced with something worse, or at least degraded in that direction. In an article that Deep State Cuba and I wrote last fall before the election, I think I might have forgotten to ask for that graphic. Don't worry about it. We warned that Trump 2.0 might be a lot more competently authoritarian than Trump 1.0 was. Now we do have it. Like what we said in that article is that, hey, just because they weren't able to sort of push through the bureaucratic obstacles and make it come to pass last time, don't count out just yet the possibility that we're going to get that MAGA dystopia. And we had a whole theory in that article of why that might be the case. But I'll also freely admit that this has been even worse than I was expecting in terms of the Trump administration limbo dancing under even my expectations for how closely they would adhere to the constitutional order. They're deporting legal residents for writing newspaper op-eds and courting a constitutional crisis by defying a 9-0 Supreme Court ruling that they need to bring back an innocent person they, accidentally sent to a Salvadorian gulag. It's grim. In fact, this is the first opening argument I've done in the last 3 where I haven't primarily focused on free speech, because Trump's war on free speech protections has been a lot, and I mean a lot, of what's been preoccupying me lately. But again, that's not what I'm talking about today. I actually do want to focus, like Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, on the taxation of trade routes. Before I get back to that, though, the reason I'm talking about the broader picture of how horrifying the first few months of Trump 2 have been is because I want to frame this issue about tariffs in the larger context of Trumpism and the public backlash against Trumpism and how it's been playing out on a lot of different issues, not just this one. A week and a half ago, I was in Chicago for an academic conference. While I was there, I was staying with my friend Bronco from Jacobin. And on the Saturday of that week, Bronco and our buddy Miles from In These Times magazine went out to the big anti-Trump hands-off rally. And I actually found it really hardening. The Chicago rally was absolutely gigantic. I heard one estimate that said it was 30,000 people. That feels about right to me. It was also interesting to see the variety of signs people had, the kind of issues that were being raised, with tens of thousands of people, lots of them sort of normie libs, kind of being freshly politicized by all the swirling insanity. You're going to get a combination of political messages, including, of course, some that I really disagree with, like people who want the war in Ukraine to keep going forever and had signs like Trump is Putin's bitch. But I was happy to see there really wasn't that much of that. For every sign like that, there were probably like 3 or 4 Free Palestine signs. And while the most common message, very appropriately from my point of view, was probably the one about democracy and authoritarianism, also because of all the Doge insanity, probably the second most popular message I saw was anti-austerity themes. Tons of stuff about hands off Medicaid, hands off Social Security, a massive amount of signs. I think probably a lot from marching veterans about cuts to the Veterans Administration. And I love that. This was, so we've got, I think, my favorite of the pictures I took that day, which is this one, right? Because I love that no kings, no oligarchy sign. And that sign was adjoined on one side by somebody with one about authoritarianism, and then the other by somebody resurrecting the Occupy Wall Street or sort of Bernie campaign language about the 99%. I think that's exactly the right message for the moment. I mean, obviously, I'm a, finicky intellectual nerd. I'd want to I have notes, right? But like the basic thrust of that, tying together the defense of democracy with a more basic point about our society's long-term horrifying levels of economic inequality. Because I don't think those issues can really be disentangled. And this brings us at last to the point I was making about tariffs, which is just this. Yes, Trump is horrifying. Yes, Trumpism 2.0 is a real crisis. But it actually matters. It matters a lot what message you use to fight it. Because there's a reason Trump is president right now. There's a reason he made massive gains with the multiracial working class, winning a higher share of Black voters, a way higher share of Latino voters than he did either of the last 2 times he ran. And for the first time, any Republican has pulled this off in fucking forever. He won a slightly high, he actually won a slight majority of low-income voters. That really shows the absurdity of libs trying to make the beginning and end of their explanation of Trumpism that Trump voters are, big, dumb, backward racists. Trump actually got the most multiracial electorate of any Republican candidate in my lifetime. Doesn't mean he's not a racist, but it does mean there's other stuff going on. And even beyond that, the much more basic point that emerges from this is that Trumpism isn't just some random effusion of evil that came in from an alternate dimension. It is, unfortunately, an all too explicable outgrowth of the sickness of a profoundly unequal society full of economic precarity and misery. It's scapegoating, it's demagoguery, but that's where it comes from. The much derided phrase economic anxiety actually is the single most important thing to understand if you want to know where this phenomenon comes from. And the second most important thing to understand would be how massively Trump has benefited from his totally unearned and, misleading reputation for somehow being anti-war. Kamala Harris was going around the country trumpeting the support of the Cheney family. So your average voter not unreasonably concluded that the comparatively anti-war candidate must be the other guy. And the reason I'm relitigating the 2024 election here in the context of setting up what I want to say about tariffs is that understanding where Trumpism comes from is absolutely essential to understanding how you can fight it. Because if the message you're using to combat it is, let's go back to the status quo that people were so disgusted with that the backlash to it led us here, that's the failingest of messages. And this takes us to the core of the point about tariffs. Because here's the problem I want to point out today. A lot of people who might think of themselves even as leftists or socialists basically spend 90% of their time tailing whatever the liberal talking point of the day is and just putting a slightly more radical spin on it. This is something I've been complaining about forever. I mean, since way back when I was co-hosting Dead Pundit Society with Adam Proctor, we used to talk about this all the time. And a lot of grassroots liberals, in turn, have a very strong instinct, a very strong one, to not just oppose whatever Trump is doing, which is, the right call somewhere well north of 99% of the time, but to go further than that, to rhetorically take the opposite of whatever Trump's rhetorical stance is. And look, sometimes that works out to be a good thing. When DOGE is slashing and burning its way through the federal budget, libs instinctively wanting to say the opposite of what Trump says end up having really good anti-austerity messages, like the ones that were already all over those hands-off rallies. When Elon Musk is treated as de facto co-president and Trump surrounds himself with the top tech billionaires in the world at his inauguration, libs having that anti-Trump reaction suddenly means there's a greatly expanded audience for leftist messages about economic inequality. And Bernie's anti-oligarchy rallies have bigger audiences than his campaign rallies even had when he was running for president. That's all fantastic. But when it comes to tariffs, the same instinct leads to a great many libs just reverting to Clinton-era free trade absolutism, to saying not just that these tariffs are idiotic and pointless and destructive, which is all true, but that the problem is tariffs per se. And anytime the government imposes any new tariff on anything or raises any existing tariff, it's just innately bad, right? So see, it's economic illiteracy, right? To think this could ever be good. That's actually in itself dangerous and stupid. And to set up why I think it's so dangerous and stupid, I want to start on the opposite end of the argument. Right? I want to roll a clip from somebody who I think is erring in the other direction, but who in her own imitable way has promoted the same kind of asinine false dichotomy that you either have to be a free trader or you have to support what Trump is doing. Those are your only options. So this is the clip I was teasing earlier from one Batya Ungar Sargon. This is her rant on the Piers Morgan show that some enterprising Twitter user delightfully set to background music.
And yet when somebody has the courage to show up and say to Wall Street, screw you, I'm waging class warfare on behalf of the American working class, and you elites in Wall Street, you do what you need to do because I'm not going to stop fighting for the American working class. Suddenly everybody is sitting around going, oh no, the stock market. Yeah, the stock market looks like that because the rich are punishing Trump for siding with the neglected and humiliated American working class over them. We have already seen these tariffs work, Pierce.
And I want to contrast Batya's barking lunacy with the position of someone who's actually capable of intellectually walking and chewing bubblegum at the same time, who's my good friend and very frequent GTAA guest, Matt McManus. We have the graphic of his tweet. And in here, he's responding to someone who's a lot smarter than Batya, frenemy of the show, Sohrab Ahmari, who, full disclosure, is a friend of mine, even though we have absolutely massive political and philosophical disagreements. And Sohrab is saying, hey, what, are you guys all free traders now, like objecting to these tariffs? And Matt very wisely responds like this. He says, Every progressive I know thinks neoliberalism needs to be replaced. That doesn't mean they want it to be replaced by autarkic mercantilism and ethno-chauvinist nationalism, especially overseen by billionaire oligarchs. No one wants to trade pneumonia for lung cancer. And I would co-sign every word of that tweet, except for the initial phrase, every progressive I know, because maybe this is semantic about who we're calling progressives. But I have very sadly seen quite a few people who could broadly be described as progressive, and even some, fairly left-wing people having trouble walking and chewing bubblegum on the tariff question. But yes, absolutely yes, on the bit about pneumonia and lung cancer. Let's just pause for a second to think about all the reasons that Batia's lunacy about Trump waging class war on behalf of the American working class is in fact lunacy. Let's start with the fact that while one good left-wing reason to actually want more manufacturing jobs to be reshored that's legitimate is that those jobs are actually historically easier to unionize than other kinds of jobs where you tend to have smaller workplaces and where workers have less strategic leverage over capital when they strike. That's all true. But Trump is doing all of this at the same time that he's waging a scorched earth war against organized labor. He made a credible effort to essentially abolish the National Labor Relations Board, illegally firing Gwynne Wilcox and bringing the board below quorum so it can't actually fight back legally against the challenge Elon Musk is waging in the court system, where he's challenging the basic constitutional basis of the NLRB's enforcement powers to protect workers who are fired for organizing unions. As it goes through different appeals courts and stuff, she keeps on being restored to her seat and then removed again, and we'll see what happens. But it might still work, Trump's maneuver there. He's also unilaterally canceled federal workers' collective bargaining agreements and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's probably the most anti-labor presidential administration since Herbert Hoover. So even if his sweeping and chaotic tariffs somehow led to jobs coming back, which they fucking won't, Trump would do everything in his power to guarantee that they wouldn't be union jobs, which means that the working class wouldn't be able to capture any real chunk of the benefits of the reshoring. Because look, the reason people miss factory jobs and, coal mine jobs and et cetera, and want them to come back in those regions, even if they're not unemployed, even if they've managed to get service industry jobs, isn't because factory work or mine work was innately more fun. Trust me, I have known people from back, where I grew up who, have worked in auto factories. Hey, Matt, if you're watching the show right now. And I've heard stories. My dad worked in an auto factory, for a bit in the 70s, and he still has a scar from a workplace accident back then. These are not innately fun jobs. The reason they were desirable jobs was because powerful industrial unions like the UAW, following the successes of the sit-down strike era, were able to use the collective power of those workers, their strategic leverage in key industries against capital, to deliver a decent, quote-unquote, middle-class lifestyle for those workers. And without unions, those jobs are a nightmare. As one of our guests in the main event tonight, Matt Brunig, has pointed out, McDonald's workers in Denmark make more than non-union auto workers in Alabama. So let's keep a sense of perspective. And more to the point, Batia's belief that Trump's tariff policy will bring the jobs back really is a dispatch from an alternate dimension. Take 10 seconds to think about this one. If you're a capitalist who's considering building a domestic factory, you're supposed to, what? Just believe that the current tariff policy is going to last for the next 20 years and make a major investment on the basis of that belief? Come on, it's going to be different in 72 hours. But all the liberals pushing the same false dichotomy that Batia is, but with the pluses and minuses reversed, talking about tariffs as in themselves bad or wrong or economically illiterate thing to ever do, like this is just a tool of trade policy that should never, ever be used, are equally simplistic and wrong. And in a certain way, to be honest, actually disgust me more because of what they're showing about a lot of libs' contempt for blue-collar labor and total lack of understanding of any remotely plausible left-wing theory of change. A lot of this really came to the head when UAW President Shawn Fain came out and said, wait, I don't like what Trump is doing either, but I actually do want there to be some tariffs, like on imported cars. And a lot of libs lost their minds, even though the UAW probably did more than any other union to try to beat Trump last fall. Fain was like, the most electrifying speaker at the DNC. Go on Twitter and do some searches, and you can find a zillion people yelling at him for muddying the waters of a simple anti-tariff message and therefore being, I don't know, a fascist collaborator or something. And by the way, I've seen some people claim that Fain was initially supportive of the Liberation Day nonsense and then, backed off, but that's actually wrong. That just gets the timeline wrong. When he came out and made a "yes, this is good, it's about time" message, it was when the specific auto tariffs were announced. As soon as Trump announced the sweeping so-called, reciprocal tariffs, right? That's the Liberation Day stuff. Fain immediately said, no, I'm not on board with that. So let's get the facts straight. But the bigger point is that all of these libs were essentially going from a correct opposition to what Trump is doing to basically overcorrecting all the way to apologetics for the global free trade regime that deindustrialized the region of the country I'm from, and thus gave us everything from the opioid crisis to the election of Donald Trump, and was just a body blow to the negotiating power of the biggest industrial unions that are still some of the largest and most strategically important parts of the American workers' movement, even in 2025. And to be really clear about this, it's not just a question of getting back jobs that have already been lost, or even just a question of saving jobs that haven't been lost yet. It's also, again, a question of negotiating power. The UAW has a lot less negotiating power when the auto companies can hold over their heads the threat to move operations and thus use that threat to help negotiate ever weaker and weaker contracts, which has happened a bunch of times. And this is really a life or death issue right now in 2025 for these workers, because ever since the success of the stand-up strike, especially, and those historic contracts, the auto companies have been pretty openly ramping up dual capacity production in the US and Mexico, specifically with the goal of weakening the threat to manufacturing from future auto worker strikes. And I want to say a couple of things about specific talking points that I've seen people raise when they want to lather some kind of veneer of sophistication onto just reverting to Clintonian free traderism. Like, there's this graph that was everywhere for a while last week that's supposed to show, see, the free trade deals, the China check. None of that had anything to do with deindustrialization. It's all a big myth. Really, it's 100% automation and 0% trade policy, because look, this graph that you're looking at is supposed to show a steady linear decline in manufacturing since World War II. And it's funny, the first time I heard this chart described was actually a few days before Liberation Day. So a couple weeks ago, I flew to New York to do this debate with this guy from the Manhattan Institute. If you don't know what that is, it's like a right-wing think tank. Whatever. The debate happened at like 9 a.m. New York time, which was 6 a.m. for my West Coast acclimated brain. And I had to wake up a good bit earlier than that to do it after barely sleeping. So I don't think this was exactly one of my top 10 debate performances. But whatever, when it comes out, we'll show you guys here and you can judge for yourselves. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that at the beginning, the moderator asked me to describe my personal experience, the way any personal experiences I may have had contributed to my current politics. And I talked a bit about growing up in the Rust Belt when, deindustrialization was ravaging it. And I mentioned something about free trade policies as part of that. And the Manhattan Institute guy said, oh, no, that's not true. There's this graph, showing that it's a steady, constant decline since World War II. And at the time, I had no idea what the hell he was talking about, but I was fairly confident that that was wrong. And then, of course, after Liberation Day, that graph was everywhere. So I started to be like, that was what he was talking about. It was pretty inescapable in online lib discourse for a minute. But if you look at it carefully, let's look at it one more time, right? If you look at it carefully, you can see the trick, because this is a graph of manufacturing, as you can see at the top, a share of total employment. But it should take about 5 seconds of reflection to see all the ways that might be misleading. If manufacturing is holding steady, right, like there's exactly as much manufacturing as there were, while other sectors of the economy are being born or growing, or even just growing faster than manufacturing, the result of that will be that manufacturing will decline as a share of employment, right? Hell, manufacturing jobs could be growing and the share would still be declining if it's growing at a slower rate than the general population is growing. If, I don't know, there were decades where some sort of, let's call it a baby boom was going on. And in fact, I saw Matt Huber post the second graph. We've got this one too, that is way more informative. This one shows you the absolute number of manufacturing jobs during the same period. And lo and behold, right, it dips up and down, of course, but like the overall trend is actually an increase from World War II. It hits an absolute peak at the end of the 1970s, and then it craters. So it's not that automation had nothing to do with it. Of course it did, but come on. Free trade is obviously part of this story. And by the way, I've also been seeing, including from some people I normally respect, some absolutely toxic garbage about how, all this nostalgia for, manufacturing jobs reflects a regressive patriarchal worldview because those were jobs where, people missed them because single providers could bring home the bacon while their wives stayed at home. And, so this is the bad gender politics that's behind all of this. Which is like, my God, what are we even doing here? Obviously, as an egalitarian leftist, I don't want any gender-based pressure on anyone to stay home if they don't want to. But for God's sake, the problem with that wasn't that the wages were high enough to support it. Right? That part was good. Couples with children should be able to figure out their work and child rearing arrangements however the hell they want to, whether it's both of them working in daycare. And of course, we should have free daycare to facilitate people who want to do that, or one working and one staying home, either the whole time or, alternating, for different periods of the kids, childhoods, or, both working part-time so they can spend more time with the kids or whatever, right? That's their business. In fact, you see way more of those kinds of arrangements in Nordic social democracies where people have more of an economic option to do it. There's nothing bad or anti-feminist about that. And the idea that there is, Jesus, that's some 2016 Hillary Clinton-ass nonsense. Similarly, for the idea I've seen floating around that deindustrialized worries are somehow about like specifically white nostalgia that's like racialized. No, motherfuckers. In the region I'm from, deindustrialization hit the non-white working class disproportionately harder than the white working class. Who do you think lives in Detroit? Who do you think lives in Flint or Milwaukee, where Malaika Jabali was writing about in her indispensable current affairs article several years back? I think we also have this graphic that was called the color of economic anxiety, where she showed the role of disgust at the Clintons from the black working class in Milwaukee and Hillary losing Wisconsin in 2016. I've also seen people say, why are we so concerned about saving the industrial jobs that are still left? Most of them have gone away anyway. Look to the future. Let's focus on other things. And then, the people who think they're doing the sophisticated leftist version of this take will start rattling off this wish list of other goals they think are more important than saving industrial jobs, or again, shoring up bargaining power for people who do still have those jobs when, it's, contract negotiated time. I say, no, we shouldn't focus on that. We should be focusing on, these other goals, on getting the PRO Act or anti-scabbing laws, or just, pushing to unionize service workers or tech workers, or, even stuff like, sectoral bargaining or co-determination. And look, obviously, I want every single one of those things, every item on that list. But the weaker the labor movement is, right, the less likely that we are to be able to achieve any of the more ambitious long-term goals on these lists. And the easier it is for companies to jump from country to country in search of lower wages and more submissive workforces, the weaker the labor movement we've already got will be. The neoliberal global free trade regime was built for exactly that purpose, to weaken the institutional strength of the working class. And I've even seen people who think they're doing a sophisticated leftist version of the lib, anti-tariff take say, ooh, you must not believe in international working class solidarity if you agree with Shawn Fain about wanting some targeted tariffs to bolster the bargaining power of industrial unions. You must be an economic nationalist who just cares about, American jobs for American workers and screw the rest of the world. And I hope it's obvious why that's an absurd false dichotomy. You don't have to be an economic nationalist to think that the entire international working class is worse off given a global trade regime that's designed to grease the skids of capital mobility, to make it maximally easy for capital to move from country to country in search of more desperate workers who will put up with more. If a country moves from, if a company moves a factory from country A to country B, that might be a short-term benefit for workers in country B, but long-term, they're worse off too, because capital will have the same leverage over them when it's their turn. If the country B workers get too uppity and start demanding more, they can be disciplined with a threat that the factory will move to country C. The global race to the bottom is bad for workers in the US, certainly, but it's also bad for workers in Canada, workers in Mexico, workers in Japan, workers in China, those Vietnamese peasants that, who might become workers that Benny Johnson is talking about. It's worse for all of them. Shawn Fain is very obviously right here. And if you're so committed to seeing everything through the prism of always say the opposite of what Trump says, that you can't see it, you've lost the plot. This really is walking at a very leisurely pace while chewing not even that much bubblegum. Look, Trump is pretty much always wrong. That premise is not incorrect. But that doesn't make the opposite of what he says always right. And if you want to defeat Trumpism, you need a compelling alternate vision of what society should look like along the lines that are suggested by that no kings, no oligarchy sign. And a retreat to the free trade politics of the 1990s is not it. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.